I have no good ideas for a. So this week I've mostly been working on palette fades in the style of NES games, which is sort of like a very specific thing to care a whole lot about, but it's something that I really wanted to do, like back when I made Pink Pink Bunny Machine back in like 2011, and then again when I did Super Win the Game last year. And I wasn't able to implement it in either of those games, so I was like, okay, for Gunmetal Arcadia, I have to do this. There would have been good opportunities in Super Win, I guess, when I was taking that to events last year and getting some hands-on player feedback. Someone suggested having like a transition when you go through doorways. I was like, oh yeah, that makes sense, because at the time it was basically like you stand in front of a door and press up and immediately you're on the other side. And I was like, yeah, a transition would totally make sense there. So what I ended up doing was having a wipe. So like wipe the screen from bottom to top with black and then wipe it back in on the other side of the door. So you have a second there where you aren't in control of the player, and it's not just like immediately flipping between two different screens. And that would have been a perfect opportunity to have like fade it out, fade it back in, and so many NES games did that like for Gunmetal, I was like, okay, I really have to do that this time, because I mean it's one of those things that even if I think you aren't consciously aware that NES games did this, it's such a subtle subconscious thing that when you see it you're like, oh yeah, I totally recognize that, because the NES had a limited color palette. It had 56 colors, and to do like fades to black or fades to white, typically what developers would do is they would just sort of step through all the colors in the palette and move everything one row up or one row down, because each row was roughly like the same hue, just in different levels of brightness. So by shifting the rows up or down, you would get one step darker, one step lighter, and yeah, it gives this very sort of like quantized fade look that's very distinctly characteristic of the NES. And I knew that was something that if I could recreate that, it would be like instantly recognizable. Like, oh yeah, that's totally something I would have seen in an NES game. So then I had to figure out, well, okay, how do I actually make this effect work? And what I've ended up doing is implementing palette fades in Gunmetal Arcadia as a color grading lookup table. Now, color grading goes back to like film. Digital color grading really started becoming prevalent in the early 2000s with movies like Oh Brother, Where Art Thou? Now it's basically almost every film you see has digital color grading applied to it. And typically in film it would be implemented with color curves and stuff for maximum accuracy. But in video games, because they have to run in real time, have to be fast and performant, typically you'll see these implemented with lookup tables. And the way a color grading lookup table works is after you render the scene with no effects on it, you go back and on a pixel by pixel basis, you take the red, green, and blue components of each pixel and use those as indices into a 3D texture map. Now, you could actually implement the lookup table as a 3D texture map. Typically it will be done actually as a 2D map where you have individual slices sort of all laid out in a row, and that's what I've done in Gunmetal Arcadia too. It's easier because I already have support for two-dimensional textures. But yeah, so you take the input red, green, and blue components and you use those as texture coordinates, index into your lookup table, and the value you get back is the replacement pixel. You do this for every pixel in the scene and you have a new image where the colors have all been tweaked. And you can sort of generate these lookup tables offline, either programmatically or with Photoshop or whatever else, and then in the game you just basically do it as a very fast pixel shader, and it's fast, it's performant, and it gives roughly the same results as if you're using Photoshop color curves or whatever. Typically in video games you'll see this used to either give individual scenes a particular feel. Sometimes you'll see color grading used across the entire game to give it a certain feel. Deus Ex Human Revolution is a great example where everything's sort of crushed down into that black and gold palette. But what I'm doing with Gunmetal Arcadia is I'm not trying to colorize the entire image. I actually already did that as part of the CRT simulation for Super Win the Game, where I shift the palette a little bit to recreate the look of an NTSC signal. And I'm basically reusing the same technology here, but rather than, sort of subtly shift the palette, what I'm doing is just like wholesale saying, okay, no, replace this color with this other color instead. So what I've done is, if you look at the NES color palette, you've got 56 colors. Typically you'll see these arranged as 14 columns, 4 rows. Every column represents a different hue. The rows represent different levels of brightness. And what we want to do to fade the scene out is basically replace each one of these colors with the next row above it. As we do this, each row gets darker and darker, and eventually everything compresses down to black. We could also do this the other way around. If we wanted to fade to white, we could replace every row with the row below it, and each row would get brighter and brighter, and then we would replace them with white. And I might end up doing that for Gunmetal Arcadia if I feel like I have a need to fade things to white. There were some NES games that did that. Kirby's Adventure is one of those, as you can see here. But for right now, I'm focusing on fading to and from black. That was more characteristic of NES games. So what I've done is I've actually, offline, I've pre-computed 5 texture maps, 5 lookup tables at each step of this transition process. The first is actually just the basic NES color palette. So you've got your red, green, and blue pixels indexing into this map, and the reason this texture map looks sort of chunky and blocky here is because all the values in this texture map are only those 56 colors in the NES color palette. The next set of texture maps, I replace each one of these with the next row up in the palette. So you can see large sections of this map go to black when I do this. As I continue the sequence, larger and larger regions become black, and I'm left with only very dark colors left in the lookup table. And finally, the last lookup table is just completely black across the board, and this is the entire screen has faded out. There's no color anywhere. So I pre-compute these offline. I load them up at runtime, upload them to the video card as soon as the game starts, and at that point, it's setting a shader parameter to choose which level I want. So there's actually no runtime cost to do this color shift. I would be setting that shader parameter in any case anyway, so there's no cost to saying, well, use this one texture instead of this other texture. So really the only cost is that now I'm doing one more full screen post process in the space of the game scene, which is a 256 by 240 texture map. It's fairly small, fairly minimal cost to render a full screen, but to render a quad that covers that entire section. So this is it's not a huge cost. It lets me do full screen palette fading across the entire scene, as opposed to having to implement this sort of specifically for sprites versus for the environment backgrounds and for text and HUD and UI and all sorts of things separately. It's just a complete wholesale fade the entire screen out, bring it all back. So I'm happy with how that turned out. I'm right now the only use cases I have for this are transitions between either transitions through doorways, transitions to and from the overworld map, like I talked about earlier. I guess I'm also working on like an intro cutscene, so probably I would fade between slides for that. But I'll be on the lookout for other opportunities where maybe I could use this for like having one level just be in partial darkness all the time, or maybe maybe the player has to find like a torch or a lantern or something to light their way. I don't yet know what exactly opportunities this will facilitate, but it's something that I've been wanting to implement in my sort of retro game engine now for a while, and I'm really happy with how it's turned out. It's one of those things that just so immediately feels like you're playing an NES game when you see those effects. So yeah, I'm happy with that. So like I mentioned last week, I'm going to be doing some regional events in the near future. I believe the weekend of July 16th and 17th, I'm going to be up in Frisco for SGC, and then the weekend after that, I'll be down in Austin for Classic Game Fest. I'll be showing off Super Win the Game again, showing off some of the new speedrun content that I've added to that game. And I'll try to have Gunmetal Arcadia there in some fashion, whether that's a playable in-development build or just a trailer loop or something. I will try to show something. So if you have a chance to make it to one or both of those events, I look forward to seeing you there. I will also be selling Super Win the Game there if you haven't picked it up yet. I'll have 3D glasses and the gamepads from the Indie Box version of the game to sell as well. So if you've been wanting to find one of those, I will have those for sale. So yeah, I look forward to seeing you there. As always, if you have any questions or comments, you can leave those below this video. You can also hit me up on Twitter or on ask.fm. My username is Pirate Hearts on both of those. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.